The Black Rose McQueen. I wanted to give a shout out to Ring IQ Boxing, and remember to tune in to the motherfucking relay.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news. Ow!
Okay, we'll start with this. Per an article from World Boxing News, the WBC clarified Tyson Fury's franchise future ahead of AJ talks. Suleiman exclusively replied to World Boxing News, "I have seen in several media reports. There are speculation comments from boxing promoters and members of the media about the World Boxing Council's intentions to designate the status of franchise champion to WBC World Heavyweight Champion Tyson Fury. We can clarify to WBN that there's certainly been zero communication with any party with this request. I have only seen it in the media. The WBC has consistently confirmed that a mandatory bout between the WBC World Heavyweight Champion must take place with the mandatory challenger and interim champion Dillian White. This must take place after Fury versus Wilder 3. Under those circumstances and with an order in place, the WBC would not consider a request to elevate anyone in the heavyweight division to franchise champion before that division's mandatory obligations are fulfilled." And yet, the WBC elevated Vasyl Lomachenko to franchise champion at a time when he had a mandatory challenger all lined up. Devin Haney became the mandatory challenger to the WBC's lightweight version of the title in September of 2019.
When he beat Saul Abdulaev.
A month later, at the WBC's convention in Cancun, Mexico,
In October of 2019.
Vasyl Lomachenko was crowned franchise champion. This is after a mandatory challenger had emerged. This is after Devin Haney became that mandatory challenger. And the only real difference between this situation with Tyson Fury and that situation with Vasyl Lomachenko is the order hadn't come down yet for Loma to satisfy his mandatory challenger. But better still, there was a mandatory challenger, and that obligation had not been fulfilled.
Made Loma franchise champion anyway.
So here today, with this, in reference to Tyson Fury and what the future may hold, you'll excuse me for saying so, but I don't have absolute trust, absolute faith that the WBC will stick to their guns and enforce this mandatory.
I've no reason to.
As it should have never taken this long. It should have never gotten this far in the face fucking place for Dillian White to get a title shot.
Just shouldn't have.
The argument was that because Dillian White wasn't the interim champion heavyweight division, that's why he wasn't the mandatory challenger in spite of being ranked as the number one contender for the longest time, going on, 2 to 3 years now? That's what the argument was, that because he wasn't the interim champion, that's why he wasn't Wilder's official mandatory challenger. Then Wilder, now Fury. But Dominic Breazeale wasn't the interim champion and you ordered Wilder to fight him.
Remember.
Tyson Fury wasn't the interim champion and you ordered Wilder to fight him too.
Remember.
When it comes to Dillian White, all kinds of hairs have to be split and all kinds of orders have to come down in order for him to get the same title shot that those two guys got so easily without being interim champions.
I don't trust these guys to do their job.
And that is where that sentiment comes from. Comes from a place to where it never should have took this long. It never should have got this far, but it did. There was no reason in the world, that is, no justifiable reason, for Dominic Breazeale to be made Deontay Wilder's mandatory challenger at a time when Dillian White was ranked ahead of him and had won more fights in succession at that time than Dominic Breazeale did. But that is what happened, and it happened that way because the WBC wanted it to happen that way.
Why the fuck would I trust them to do their job?
Dominic Breazeale received mandatory status from the WBC in the absence of an interim title, in the absence of being interim champion. Hell, in February of last year, the WBC themselves voted unanimously that that same Dominic Breazeale should have to fight Dillian White, forget this, an interim belt. Interim belt? Because he didn't actually fucking have one. Early last year, the WBC went as far as ordering Deontay Wilder to fight Tyson Fury in a rematch. That was an order with a deadline for a purse bid. Tyson Fury wasn't the interim champion.
He wasn't.
But they still ordered that fucking fight, didn't they?
Yes, they did.
And we know what happened. We know that the rematch was postponed as a result of Tyson Fury crossing the street over to the top-ranked side of things. And at this time, what the WBC then decided to do was order Wilder to fight Breazeale, who was his mandatory, but wasn't interim champion. You see the difference? When it's Dillian White, he's got to jump through all these hoops and fight in all these eliminators, and he's got to be interim champion in order for them to order the goddamn fight. But Dominic Breazeale, Tyson Fury, they didn't have to jump through all those hoops. They didn't have to go through that entire rigorous process in order to be granted the same world title opportunity that Dillian White has been deprived of. So you'll excuse me for saying so, but I don't trust the WBC to do their job.
Why the fuck would I?
In spite of what assurances they're making here and now. They're essentially saying that because Dillian White is the interim champion, and because the order has already come down, the order is already in place, that they are not considering anyone for franchise status at this weight until that obligation is fulfilled. That all sounds nice. Very good.
After making him wait this long.
But even if that's true, and even if the WBC actually sticks to their guns this time and enforces the mandatory, imposes it upon Tyson Fury, there really still isn't anything stopping Tyson Fury from simply throwing that belt in the air and going back to calling himself the lineal champion.
What's stopping him?
Which he is or isn't, depending on who you ask. Oh, he might have to hold on to that WBC title long enough that it'll be on the line in the third Wilder fight. He's got to give him a chance to win it back, right? But after that...
What's stopping him from chucking it?
I told you that I don't think Tyson Fury would stand for ceremony, and shortly after that video was uploaded, what did we see? Comments coming out from Tyson Fury about how he's not interested in fighting Dillian White, and that belts are nothing but pieces of leather with metal on them. So, even if the door is closed for Tyson Fury to petition for franchise status to avail him of his obligations as a champion, even if he doesn't have that option, there's still nothing stopping him from throwing that belt in the air
And running off.
and avoiding Dillian White. In layman's terms, I've got no reason to trust that the WBC is actually going to do their job this time, but even if they did, that doesn't guarantee that Tyson Fury won't simply throw that belt in the air to get out of this fight. Maybe Dillian White catches it.
Maybe.
Maybe he becomes the full-fledged WBC champion. These are all scenarios we have to entertain because all of this is entirely possible. Moving on. In other news, an interesting little story that I didn't get the chance to address earlier this week per a tweet from Steve Kim. So sources say that there were efforts to make a fight by Golden Boy for Ryan Garcia and Javier Fortuna for late summer. Samson Lukowicz, who promotes Fortuna, says they were all aboard, but then were told the fight was not accepted by Garcia's side. There are many interesting angles, interesting layers to this story.
From both sides.
The story alleges that Samson Lukowicz was all aboard to let his boy Javier fight with Ryan, where that same Samson Lukowicz wasn't all aboard to let his boy Javier fight Devin Haney. Did you guys forget that Samson Lukowicz rejected the proposition of his boy Javier fighting Devin Haney and instead wanted to go ahead with a Luke Campbell fight?
A final eliminator.
A Luke Campbell fight which would service as a final eliminator to get a crack at Devin Haney. Rather, Devin Haney's belt. Devin Haney's side of things wanted to just go ahead and fight Javier straight away, but Samson Lukowicz would hear none of it.
No.
He wanted to proceed as planned with that Luke Campbell fight.
Make of that what you will.
But this same Samson Lukowicz was all aboard for a Ryan Garcia fight. If that's true, if this story checks out,
What, are you nervous?
would appear that Samson Lukowicz might view Ryan Garcia as a more beatable guy than Devin Haney. I mean, why are you all on board for Ryan Garcia, but you're not on board for Devin Haney? What gives?
What, are you nervous?
That is one side of it. The other side of it is the Ryan Garcia side. This goes back to something that I told you guys before, that the Ryan Garcia people see more value in putting Ryan in there with a Jorge Linares because at least Jorge Linares has a bit of a profile.
More than Javier.
For having knocked down Vasyl Lomachenko and for having been a world champion at the weight.
Risky fight, though.
Risky opponent, yes, but there are rewards. Whereas Javier, there are risks associated with the Javier Fortuna fight. Comes to Ryan Garcia, there are risks there, but the rewards, they're minimal.
What do you get out of beating him?
Now, I told you guys, as a hardcore boxing fan, I love the idea of Ryan Garcia versus Javier Fortuna. That's the kind of solid opponent, the kind of solid fighter that Ryan Garcia needs on his resume for his advancement as a fighter. But in the realm of risks versus rewards, the realm that, Ryan Garcia's handlers live in, they might not see Javier Fortuna as being a worthwhile challenge. Too much risk and not enough reward.
That's what this implies.
That, as far as Javier's side of things was concerned, Samson Lukowicz, they were all for it. They were on board. But it's the Ryan Garcia side of things
That didn't want to accept the fight.
And that's more or less what I told you was going to happen. That's more or less how I told you they viewed a guy like Javier Fortuna. Too much risk, not enough reward. And what likely brought all this on, this set of negotiations that seems to have ended before it even started, is that where Luke was supposed to fight Javier in a final eliminator, like I just mentioned, as it turns out, Luke might actually get fast-tracked to a Devin Haney fight him straight away, as both guys seem to want it. That, in turn, leaves Javier Fortuna out in the cold without a dance partner. We all know Ryan Garcia's situation. Ryan was supposed to be fighting Jorge Linares in his very next fight, but Jorge, he's all the way over there in Japan. In the midst of this pandemic, they'd have to try to figure out a way to get that guy over here.
So Ryan ain't got no dance partner either.
In that situation, the ideal solution would be to have a guy like Ryan square off against a guy like Javier Fortuna. Would be the ideal scenario, the ideal outcome for both guys who may end up getting left out in the cold without dance partners, you would think. But like I said, to a guy like Ryan Garcia, a young guy who's still looking to make a name for himself, make his bones as a professional fighter, and needs to step up gradually in competition, the risks really do have to match the rewards, at least as far as his handlers are concerned. And with a guy like Javier, to them, that's just not the case. So I really don't know who Ryan's going to be fighting in his very next fight or when he's going to be fighting. It's not going to be Jorge, and apparently it's not going to be Javier either. And finally, a follow-up to a story that we talked about here on the channel a few weeks ago in reference to who exactly would Errol Spence be facing in his very next fight. Whilst there were reports that it's supposed to be Danny Garcia on a pay-per-view set to go down, I guess, sometime in the fall?
Right, yeah.
Errol appears to have caught wind of this Maurice Lee guy. This Maurice Lee guy who's been running around telling people that he's supposed to be fighting Errol Spence in his very next fight. And to that, Errol Spence was quoted as saying, dude did a whole interview lying, saying in Jesus' name after every sentence. I'm fighting him for 10 M's. Contract been signed, press conference July 8th in Jesus' name. He said TD Jakes and Creflo bringing their whole congregation. Dude is weird as fuck. As I stated, this is in reference to Maurice Lee. Maurice Lee, who goes by the name Powered by Christ on Instagram, who, I reiterate, has been running around telling every man, woman, and his dog that he's supposed to be fighting Errol Spence in his very next fight. And as you can imagine, this created a lot of confusion because as far as the boxing community knew, as far as the boxing community was concerned, Errol Spence's very next fight was going to come by way of Danny Garcia. So Maurice Lee running around telling people that he was going to be fighting Spence next created a lot of confusion.
Who the fuck is this guy?
And in an effort to try and reconcile why Maurice Lee would be running around telling people this, I myself figured, you know what, Maurice Lee, this guy ain't battle-tested at the world level. This is about as unheralded a welterweight as unheralded welterweights go. So perhaps
He's a tune-up.
Spence is fighting this guy as a tune-up fight. I also happened to notice that Maurice Lee is a southpaw, so once again, whilst trying to reconcile this information, I thought to myself, well, if he's fighting a guy like this as a tune-up fight, and the guy's a southpaw, I don't know, maybe he's getting ready for Crawford. As we all know, Crawford is ambidextrous, but he does spend a good portion of a fight fighting out of the southpaw stance. That was my attempt to make sense of, this Maurice Lee guy and what he was saying.
Though I wasn't fully on board.
I wasn't completely sold on the idea that Errol was going to be fighting this guy next, but in the event that he did, I had to try to wrap my mind around why would that be? Why would you fight this guy? And that's the most logical explanation I could come up with. But since then, little by little, I kept tabs on this Maurice Lee guy, and I started to notice that he doesn't really seem all there upstairs, that the more you peel the onion back, the more it stinks. And this guy, he seems to have a screw loose. He's not playing with a full deck. It's almost like he tried to speak the fight into existence.
By lying?
The whole Deontay Wilder thing. Speak it, achieve it, relieve it, or receive it, or whatever the fuck it is. It seems that Maurice Lee was of that school of thought, that perhaps if he runs around telling people that he's fighting Errol Spence in his very next fight, it will come into fruition, it will materialize.
The law of attraction.
That you more or less attract the things you think about, and that there is power in the spoken word. In truth, it's not the craziest hierarchy of thought. I've ever heard. But what is a little crazy is when you go as far as embellishing details, fabricating dates, numbers, specific components of a fight that you know isn't going to happen.
Does he know?
Maybe he doesn't know. Maybe in his own mind, it's as real to him as everything else. Your guess is as good as mine, though this pattern of behavior struck Errol Spence as particularly peculiar, and I have to say that I share that sentiment. The more I followed this guy, the more I started to notice that he just doesn't appear to be all there upstairs.
He's nuts.
Look, it's not unusual for a fighter to try to talk himself into a fight, talk himself into a situation. I mean, for Christ's sakes, that's what Jarrell Miller did with Anthony Joshua, and he was almost there. He was almost home until he got caught with every performance-enhancing drug you can think of in his system. But better still, he did talk himself into that fight. And a guy talking himself into a fight really isn't the strangest thing we've ever seen in the sport of boxing, but this Maurice Lee guy, he does seem...
You aces short of a full deck?
As it is rather indignant to embellish certain details of a press conference that isn't set to happen for a fight that you're not set to have, for dollar amounts you were not promised, and contracts that were not signed. You're running around telling people this. That kind of indignant behavior. I mean, the guy's oblivious to the truth. He's oblivious to reality. And because he's oblivious to reality, it would seem that he is out of touch with it. When you're out of touch with reality, you're one fucking nose hair away from being full-blown crazy. You know, I'm just surprised that it took Errol Spence this long to address this guy, to address these rumors, because this guy's been running around saying this shit for weeks.
He has.
And because there was no word from Errol Spence regarding this subject, I myself didn't know whether it was true or false. Without Errol Spence actively confirming or denying what this guy was saying, I didn't know what to make of it, so I had to entertain it as a possible scenario since no one came out to dispel this rumor.
Took him long enough.
At least now we know that Maurice Lee's claims don't actually hold any water, though why he targeted Spence of all people is anybody's guess. I mean, I don't know.
The guy's nuts.
He's got obsessive-compulsive tendencies. Maybe he's got like a single white female kind of deal going on to where, you know, he sees Spence, he wants to be Spence, and he subsequently wants to beat Spence, you know? That kind of thing.
But at least now we know.